Mark Boris Andrijanič, bivši slovenski ministar za digitalnu transformaciju, nas je gost u serijalu N1 Disinfo, a sada, Mark, radite u jednoj od velikih AI globalnih kompanija. We will switch to English because it's maybe easier for us, even though you are our neighbor and Slovenian. I want to ask you, people, when you go out, the talk of the town is AI. We won't talk about AI in its full content, but we will talk about it in terms of disinformation and our democracy resilience. So from your perspective, you've been in government and you are now in private sector, but in the US. How do you see the role of AI for our democracies?
First of all, you're right. This is today everyone's favorite topic. Everyone loves to talk about it, although not many people really understand it. It's a very advanced and complicated technology, so yeah, it's a mystery for many of us. I would say that the public conversation around AI is very similar in the US as it is in Europe and in our countries. We all see it as an amazing new technology that carries a lot of risks for our privacy, for our democracy, and for our mental health. So for our democracies, obviously, there is a bit of a risk there. We've seen a proliferation of AI-enabled disinformation, especially after the outbreak of the war in Ukraine. You may remember, but just a couple of days after Russians attacked Ukraine, there was a deepfake video of President Zelensky allegedly urging Ukrainians to stop fighting and surrender. But we've seen also much more subtle and believable attempts with AI-empowered disinformation across Central and Eastern Europe and the world. So I think we're still grappling with how to counter this kind of threats. They are problematic because they're easily scalable. This kind of disinformation is very believable because it looks like a person, it speaks like a person, it transfers a message that can be very nuanced, very believable. And it does all of this at scale. So you can deploy, millions of AI chatbots in an hour, which means that you're getting the kind of scale that's difficult to counter oftentimes. So who carries the responsibility? First of all, it's the big social media platforms, because they're the primary vehicle for the spread of this kind of information. And they're doing that already. So they have their own AI systems that are battling the other, let's say, the dark AI systems.
They have it, they're trying to have it or trying to implement, maybe to be more correct, because
not always
we don't
successfully.
see that. Yeah.
We know that. And what has struck me, especially in the Ukrainian context, it turned out that these big platforms had very few content moderators in our part of the world, in countries of Central and Eastern Europe that are, I would say, at the forefront of Russian disinformation. We realized that even some of the biggest platforms don't have native-speaking content moderators in places like Czech Republic, which is not a small country, let alone the Baltic states or Slovenia and Croatia, which is
Balkans,
unacceptable.
Which is out of EU, for example.
Exactly. I think they have always been looking at us as, a very small market, almost like a statistical error. So I don't think they've been dedicating enough resources to build a network that could basically help them counter this kind of spread of disinformation. To be fair, I think they've done great progress since then. I think that time was a big wake-up call, not just for our societies, but also for the big tech companies. So they're doing much more in this area, but the fight is never over.
We're filming this, we're in Prague. You've mentioned, let's say, maybe a little bit, how to say, more attack of foreign malign influence on this part of Europe. We in former Yugoslav countries, let's call them, because the language is still, we can understand each other even though we're speaking now in English. But in terms of understanding the concepts that can be developed through AI, we talk about generative AI, we talk about deep fakes, you've mentioned the video of Zelensky, just to people to kind of understand, because we live in times where it's huge amount of different sources of information. People with their cognitive capabilities cannot basically, if they're not working on that as you and I are, cannot understand what can be presented to them in various ways. So maybe to say to people what to think about when they go online and when they receive information? What's the important thing concerning AI's role in spreading and creating this information?
I think this is a great point, and I think there are two elements to the answer. First of all, this information is no longer, straightforward or black or white. So the Russians aren't trying to convince them that they're the good guys, because nobody would believe that. What they want to achieve, and they're not the only ones, is to basically shatter our trust in ourselves and in our institutions. And they've been doing that quite successfully in many Western European countries, as well as in our part of the world.
And I will now be a disruptive European citizen who will say, no, you won't tell me what to think. I know, I can see from what I get online what's the truth and what's not. How to fight this attitude?
First of all, I think it starts in schools. It's not just about technology, it's also about cultivating critical thinking. And then I think great responsibility lies with our politicians. It seems that many of them, are very happy to take advantage of this kind of chaos to further deteriorate trust within our societies. So they need to start acting as grown-ups, so to speak, so that people regain the trust that has been lost in the past decades, perhaps. And it's also a big responsibility for the tech firms to do everything they can to stop this kind of attempts from happening. Now, this is very tricky because it collides with the principle we all hold very dear, which is freedom of speech, and the principle, our grandfathers were risking their lives for in Yugoslavia and in the Soviet Union. So I think it's a very delicate balance. We'll never get it completely right, but we have to try.
So you mentioned Europe, you were the Minister of Digital Transformation. How important it is for EU countries, like individually, to understand how this is important, because we now see Europe basically at the forefront of the regulation. We have this suggestion of the new AI regulation, we have big tech legislation that is going to start working in next year, 2024. So how important it is that Europe basically positions itself in such a way?
I think it's very important. And one other thing, Europe wants to be a leader in AI, which is quite an illusion at this point with all the new AI tools like ChatGPT coming from the US. But if you want to be a leader, you need to have people believing in that technology and trusting it. And right now, there's very little trust in AI. And this is where I see the role of the AI Act that is being adopted here in Europe. I think, although it's not perfect, it will increase the trust of the society in AI. And I think that's good for everyone, including the tech industry. But at the same time, I think we need to make sure that we are stimulating innovations in this area and that we're not left behind not just the US, but also China, which is speeding ahead in the area of AI. So we need to balance regulation with innovation much better. But you're right, the EU is basically the first major jurisdiction adopting comprehensive AI legislation. Many others will follow, but what I can tell you is that I'm not seeing a big regulatory revolution at the moment. We see more of a slow-moving evolutionary process. Everyone will get to some kind of regulation, but most countries today are talking about guidelines, are talking about voluntary codes of conduct, and so on. So countries taking very different approach to technology that not many of us really understand.
And my last point is, you've mentioned education and critical thinking. These are the buzzwords, but basically we know that education systems are very slow changing mechanisms, and in today's accelerating world, some say that technology can help, people to adjust more to this new economy, but education is always lagging behind in a sense. So how do we include maybe new generation, because we see, a couple of last huge hacker attacks in European soil were made by 17-year-olds. So you have apps, you have, concepts that I don't understand that they can do and work on and, create the whole new worlds. We see that as a one track. The second track is, we've mentioned malign state actors as, Russia, but China has its tool, which is TikTok. Third thing is, you have various radical movements that are using AI that influence, we can talk about, from Hamas to whomever. So where do we position ourselves? Do we include youth in this conversation? Do we include youth in this work for our future concerning also AI? And how?
Mean, youth is
and
our
how?
future.
Yes.
So they need to be included. They are already extremely active in this field. Yes, there's a lot of, I would say, false information on platforms like TikTok and others that you mentioned. But, we see that young people are increasingly critical. They want to know, they want to understand, they want to create. They're much more entrepreneurial or innovative when we were as, kids. And that really, I think, encourages me. Now back to the schooling system. I think young people should start learning advanced digital tools and skills very early on. I love the case
who will
of...
teach them?
So it doesn't happen overnight. But in Estonia, many years ago, they started with this amazing program called Programming Tiger, which basically taught kids in kindergartens how to code or solve complex that are a bit more complex. And I think this is the right way forward. We want young kids to master these technologies, to make sure they're not just users or blind users of them, but creators of the new innovations. Now back to the critical thinking. I think it's very hard to tell you what's the silver bullet. I don't think there is one.
Of course.
I would mention the, take for example the community notes on X, formerly known as Twitter. I think they are an interesting step forward, an interesting experiment, meaning that instead of deleting some kind of content that many people can find distrustful, you basically put a community note that alarms people that this information might not be true, that it might be influenced by a state or any other actor, so that people are still exposed to the content, but at the same time have the warning, and that allows them and stimulates them to, critically think about that. Because what I'm afraid of is actually tech companies taking the power to start deciding what they deem as true and what they deem as false. And I don't think it's something they want to do. I think content moderation is not their favorite thing. It's something that, is more of a burden for them. So, and I don't blame them for that. But we need to come up with this kind of innovative tools that will be able to portray more content than probably today, but have, the proper label, a proper community note, and so on.
Mark Boris Andrijanič, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for inviting me.